The candles in Jasmine Walsh's bedchamber have been burning since midnight. Not because she cannot sleep, she gave up on sleep 3 weeks ago, when the child began pressing against her ribs like a fist demanding entry into a world that had not yet proven itself worthy. The candles burn because she is reading. Because the document in her lap arrived by private courier at 11:30, sealed with a wax crest she does not recognize, addressed not to Mrs. George Walsh, the name she has worn like a borrowed coat for 3 years, but to Miss Jasmine Hartwell. Her father's name. Her real name. The one that still means something in this city. Outside, the Thames breathes its cold, dark exhale against the embankment walls. The fog rolls in from the water the way it always does in October, without apology, without warning, filling every corner of London until the gas lamps look like dying stars. Tonight, 50 carriages are lined outside the manor. 50 families of consequence are downstairs, drinking her champagne, admiring her chandeliers, and asking one another, very quietly, where the hostess has gone. They do not know she is up here. They do not know what is written in this document. And George Walsh, her husband, her captor, the most charming liar in 3 counties, does not yet know that the last move has already been made. He just doesn't know it's against him. Welcome. Pour yourself something strong. Jasmine's story doesn't forgive the faint-hearted. Stay close. The physician left an hour ago. He pressed 2 fingers to her wrist, listened to the child's heartbeat with practiced, clinical detachment, and told her what he always told her. Rest, Mrs. Walsh, rest is the great remedy. He had not looked her in the eye when he said it. Physicians in George's employ had a habit of studying the floor. Jasmine had thanked him with the same gracious composure she thanked everyone, the cook, the footman, the solicitor who had come last Tuesday with papers she was not meant to read but had memorized regardless. Composure was the armor her mother had left her. The only inheritance George could not touch. She reads the document again. 3 pages. Forensic in its precision. Column after column of transactions made in her name, her signature, she notices, on dates when she was confined to this very room, too ill to hold a pen. Loans drawn against her trust. Notes payable to creditors she has never met, in cities she has never visited. A paper architecture built by a brilliant, desperate man who believed his wife was too gentle, too grateful, and too pregnant to look carefully at anything he placed before her. Her father's investigators had been looking for 11 months. The footman appears at the door, young Thomas, the one who still has the decency to look her in the eye. The guests are asking for you, Mr. Walsh says. Tell my father, Jasmine says, folding the document with the steady hands of a woman who has already decided everything, that the panic has begun. Thomas blinks. Downstairs, George Walsh raises his glass to toast his happy home. He has no idea the floor is already gone. The roses arrived every Monday. 12 stems, white, arranged by the florist on Belgrave Square who charged more for the delivery than most families spent on supper. They were placed on the escritoire by the east window, George's standing order, maintained with the same efficient joylessness as the household accounts. Jasmine had stopped reading the cards after the 4th week of her pregnancy, when she noticed they were all signed in the same handwriting. Not George's. His secretary's. She did not mention it. That was the first lesson this house had taught her. Silence was the currency of survival here. From the outside, the Walsh estate was the kind of address that made men straighten their spines and women recalculate. 4 stories of Portland stone on a street where old money and new ambition kept a careful, competitive distance from one another. The staff was immaculate. The gardens, geometric. The dining room seated 24, and on the nights it did, Jasmine presided at the far end of the table like a painting that had learned to pour wine and ask the right questions about Eton and interest rates. She had been good at it, once. She had believed, with the particular optimism of a woman raised in warmth, that performance and devotion were the same thing. The pregnancy had stripped that illusion bare. 7 months in, she rarely descended to the main floor before noon, and only then if George had guessed he needed her to decorate the afternoon with. The child moved constantly, an urgent, restless presence, as though already impatient with the world it had been assigned to. Jasmine would press her palm flat against her stomach in the small hours and speak quietly, not prayers exactly, but something adjacent. Promises. Corrections. The things she wished someone had told her before she signed her name to a life she did not yet understand. Her closest companion was Mrs. Aldridge, the housekeeper, who brought chamomile without being asked and had the wisdom to ask nothing in return. Her friends, the women from before, from her father's world, had drifted, the way friends do when a woman becomes a wife and a wife becomes a condition. George called it contentment. Jasmine had another word for it. She just hadn't said it aloud yet. George came to her room at 2:30 on a Tuesday, which told her everything she needed to know about the state of his affairs. He never visited midweek. Midweek was for the exchange, for lunches at his club, for the careful maintenance of a reputation that required more daily labor than he would ever admit. When he appeared at her door on a Tuesday afternoon, still in his overcoat, his hair carrying the cold of the street, Jasmine understood that something had broken, and that she was the one being asked to fix it. He did not sit. George never sat in her presence anymore. Sitting implied a conversation, and conversations implied equality. He stood at the foot of her chaise, briefcase in hand, and placed the document on the cushion beside her with the casual authority of a man setting a trap he has decided to call a gift. "It's straightforward," he said. "A restructuring. The Hartwell clause creates complications with the new lenders. One signature, and it's resolved by Friday." Jasmine looked at the document without touching it. "Which lenders?" A pause. Barely a second. But she had been studying his pauses for 3 years, cataloging them the way a naturalist catalogues weather patterns, and this one carried the particular weight of a man who has rehearsed an answer he does not intend to give. Continental Partners. It's handled. She had learned, in recent months, to follow the money rather than the words. The words were always elegant. The money told the truth. She had noticed the calls he took in the East Wing with the door locked, the solicitor who arrived on a Friday evening and left before dinner, the way George's jaw tightened whenever the post arrived before he could intercept it. She had said nothing. She had watched instead. "I'd like our solicitor to review it," she said. "Mr. Pemberton." "Pemberton is unnecessary. I've had it reviewed." "By your people." "By competent people, Jasmine." The temperature in the room dropped a precise degree. "This is not a negotiation. It is a formality. Sign it." She placed her hand over her stomach, slowly, deliberately, and met his eyes with the calm of a woman who has already stopped being afraid. "Leave it with me," she said. "I'll read it tonight." George picked up his briefcase. His knuckles, she noticed, were white. The gala had been George's idea, as all performances were. 200 guests, the bestsellers raided, the manor dressed in candlelight and hothouse flowers imported from the continent at a cost Jasmine no longer asked about. It was the kind of evening designed to project solvency, which told her, with quiet precision, that solvency was exactly what they no longer had. She dressed carefully. Burgundy silk, high-waisted to accommodate the child, her mother's pearls at her throat. Mrs. Aldridge had pinned her hair without a word, but her hands had been gentle in a way that felt like an apology for something neither of them had named yet. Downstairs, George was magnificent. He always was in company, loose-limbed, warm-eyed, the kind of man who remembered every guest's preferred drink in their eldest child's school. Jasmine watched him work the room with the detached appreciation of someone observing a very skilled actor in a role they've played so long they've forgotten it isn't real. It was near 11 when he found her in the corridor off the east drawing room. She had stepped away from the noise, one hand pressed to the small of her back, the child restless and heavy. She heard his footsteps before she saw him, and she knew from the rhythm, too fast, too deliberate, that the evening had not gone as planned. "You spoke to Pemberton." "It wasn't a question. I asked him to look at the document. As I said I would. You went behind my back. His voice was low, controlled, the anger pressed down beneath the surface like something trying to find a crack. I protected my child's inheritance. As any mother would. What happened next was brief. His hand moved before she saw it coming. A single, sharp contact against her cheek that snapped her face to the side and sent one pearl earring skittering across the marble floor. The sound was almost nothing. Barely louder than a breath. He straightened his cravat. Adjusted his cufflinks. Looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he believes he has just solved. You are a vessel, Jasmine, he said. Not a partner. Then he turned and walked back toward the laughter and the light, and raised a glass to his happy home. On the floor, the pearl sat still. Waiting. Like evidence. He arrived at midnight without announcement, which was exactly how Edmund Hartwell preferred to arrive at places that mattered. No telegram. No footman sent ahead. Just the sound of a carriage heavier than George's on the gravel drive, and then the man himself in the doorway, 63 years old, silver-haired, built like someone who had decided long ago that the world would move for him rather than the other way around. Jasmine was still in the corridor when he found her. He took one look at her cheek, the faint bloom of red that powder had not entirely concealed, and something passed across his face that was not grief, not rage, but something older and colder than both. The look of a man whose calculations have just been confirmed. He crossed the distance between them and held her face in both hands with a tenderness entirely at odds with everything else about him. I should have come sooner, he said. You're here now. He nodded once. That was Edmund Hartwell's version of an apology, brief, direct, and never repeated. He did not go to find George. Not yet. Instead he guided Jasmine to the library, closed the doors, and sat across from her with the quiet authority of a man who understood that the most devastating things in the world were accomplished slowly and in writing. From his coat he produced a leather folio, worn at the corners, filled with papers that had the particular density of documents assembled over a long period of time by very careful people. I knew what he was before the wedding, he said. I had him reviewed, his finances, his associations, 2 former business partners who would not speak on record but were very forthcoming of it. He paused. Your mother asked me to give him a chance. I gave him 3 years instead. Men like George Walsh do not change, they simply find better cover. He opened the folio. Column after column of transactions. Dates. Amounts. Names Jasmine half recognized from dinner conversations she had not been meant to retain. He has been borrowing against your trust for 14 months, Edmund said. Using your signature, or something close enough to it that a casual review would not question it. Jasmine looked at the pages without flinching. How long have you been building this? She asked. Her father closed the folio with the calm of a man who has already won. Since the honeymoon, he said. Edmund did not present the evidence the way a solicitor would, methodically, with cross-references and numbered exhibits. He laid it out the way a man does when he wants someone to feel the full weight of what has been done to them. 1 page at a time. Each one worse than the last. The second apartment was in Pimlico. A quiet street, respectable enough to avoid comment, anonymous enough to avoid recognition. Leased under a variation of George's middle name, paid quarterly in cash drawn from an account Jasmine had never seen listed in any household ledger. Edmund placed the lease agreement on the library table between them and said nothing, which was its own kind of cruelty, the silence that forces a person to arrive at the conclusion themselves. The woman's name was Caroline Voss. 26. The daughter of a minor Austrian banking family, introduced to George 18 months ago at a trade dinner in Vienna. There were letters, not many, but enough. Edmund did not show Jasmine the letters themselves, he showed her only the investigator's summary, a single page, precise and merciless. She was grateful for that, and she noted the gratitude, and then she set it aside, because gratitude had no place in what this evening was becoming. The signatures were the worst of it. Not because forgery was unexpected. She had suspected something of the kind since reading the courier's document 3 nights prior. But because when Edmund laid the pages side by side, her genuine signature from their marriage contract and the replicated versions appearing on loan instruments across 14 months, the forgeries were almost perfect. Almost. The T in Hartwell crossed too low. A detail so small that only someone who had studied her handwriting with love, or with obsessive, calculating purpose, would notice. George had practiced. Somewhere, at that desk in the East Wing, behind that locked door, he had sat and practiced her name until he could wear it like his own. Jasmine looked at the pages for a long time without speaking. "He never saw me," she said finally. It was not a lament. It was a conclusion, delivered with the flat precision of someone closing a door they will never open again. Edmund gathered the papers. "No," he said. "Which is the only reason any of this was possible." He paused. "And the only reason it ends tonight." The solicitors arrived at 1:30. 3 of them, from Edmund's firm on Threadneedle Street, men who billed by the 6-minute interval and whose presence at this hour communicated, more clearly than any declaration, that what was happening in this library had been planned well in advance of tonight. The senior partner was a man named Cavendish. 60, dry, with the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have spent decades ensuring that words mean exactly what they need them to mean and nothing else. He set his case on the library table, nodded once to Edmund, once to Jasmine, and did not waste time on the architecture of the situation. He already understood it. He had, Jasmine gathered, understood it for some time. The original marriage settlement, Cavendish said, producing a document sheathed in blue legal backing, was drafted by your grandfather's firm in 1887. The language is deliberately archaic in places, which I suspect is why Mr. Walsh's solicitors failed to adequately interrogate it before he signed. He opened to a page marked with a narrow ribbon. Clause 19. Subsection 4. He read it aloud without inflection, which made it more devastating than any dramatic rendering could have achieved. The language was dense, Victorian in its convolution, but the meaning, once Cavendish had walked her through it, was surgical in its precision. Any act of gross dishonor, defined within the clause to include physical violence, financial fraud conducted under a spouse's name, or deliberate deception of the Hartwell bloodline, rendered null and void all financial instruments signed or transferred within the marriage. Every loan George had arranged using her name. Every asset repositioned under the Walsh estate. Every forged signature on every instrument across 14 months of careful, systematic theft. All of it. Unwound. As though it had never existed. Jasmine sat very still. "He signed this," she said. "Willingly," Cavendish replied. His solicitors advised him the clause was ceremonial. A relic. The kind of language old families include for tradition rather than enforcement. The faintest compression of his lips, the closest Cavendish came to contempt. They were mistaken. Edmund had not moved from his chair throughout. Now he looked at his daughter with an expression she had not seen since her mother's funeral, something unguarded, almost tender. "Your grandfather," he said quietly, "was not a sentimental man. But he was a thorough one." George retired at 2:30, which Jasmine knew because Mrs. Aldridge, loyal, watchful Mrs. Aldridge, had sent word to the library by way of the back stairs. He had drunk more than usual. The last guests had departed by midnight and he had spent the intervening hours in the East Wing with a decanter of brandy and the particular stillness of a man who believes the worst is behind him. He had no idea the night was just beginning. Edmund made 3 calls from the library telephone between 2 and 3 in the morning. Jasmine stayed. She did not ask to leave, and her father did not suggest it. The calls were brief, the kind of conversations conducted between men who have already agreed on everything and are now simply confirming sequence. A contact in Edinburgh. A partner in Frankfurt. A firm in New York whose senior director, Edmund mentioned without elaboration, owed him a considerable favor from 1987. Cavendish sat at the library table with his associates and worked through the legal instruments with the unhurried efficiency of men who have done this before and understand that precision, at this hour, is worth more than speed. By 3 o'clock, the mechanics were in motion. George Walsh's publicly listed interests, a modest but carefully cultivated portfolio of shares in 2 shipping concerns, a railway subsidiary, and a property consortium in the north, began moving in the quiet, pre-dawn channels where institutional investors settled their positions before the exchange opened. The sell-off was coordinated, led, and designed to look, at first glance, like a market correction rather than a deliberate strike. By the time anyone with the knowledge to understand what was happening looked closely enough to recognize the pattern, it would be too late to reverse it. Edmund replaced the telephone receiver after the final call and sat for a moment in silence, his hands flat on the desk. There was no satisfaction in his expression. No theater. Just the composed stillness of a man who has done what was necessary and made his peace with it before anyone else in the room had woken up to the scale of what was unfolding. By 6, he said, his credit will be called. Jasmine looked at the window. The London fog pressed against the glass, dense and absolute. Somewhere above them, George Walsh slept the deep, careless sleep of a man who had not yet learned that the ground beneath him was already gone. The first sign was the silence. George Walsh had lived in staffed houses his entire adult life and had developed, without ever consciously registering it, a precise sensitivity to the sounds of a household in motion, the early rattle of the kitchen range, the measured footsteps of a footman on the back stair, the particular quality of movement that meant the world was arranging itself for his comfort. He woke at 7 to none of it. The silence was absolute and wrong in the way that pain is wrong, immediately, before the mind has fully assembled itself to understand why. He dressed without assistance. A small humiliation that sharpened into something larger when he descended to the ground floor and found the entrance hall empty, his butler absent, and through the tall front windows, the sight of 2 carriages on the drive that did not belong to any guest he had invited. He recognized the men who stepped from them. Not personally. By type. The particular combination of heavy coats and unhurried purpose that belongs to men who arrive at houses not to be received but to inventory them. He turned from the window and went for the east wing, where the telephone sat on its stand. The line, when he lifted the receiver, returned nothing. Not a fault. A disconnection. Prearranged and precise. He took the stairs to Jasmine's floor at speed, past walls whose paintings he had already, in some calculating recess of his mind, begun to price. He did not knock. He had not knocked in 3 years. Edmund Hartwell was standing in the corridor outside her door. Not seated. Not leaning. Standing, with the straight-back composure of a man who has been waiting and considered the waiting no inconvenience whatsoever. Behind him, Cavendish. Behind Cavendish, 2 associates whose expressions communicated a complete and practiced indifference to whatever George Walsh intended to say next. George stopped. Whatever speech he had assembled on the staircase, the indignation, the threats, the particular brand of cold authority he deployed when cornered, dissolved on contact with his father-in-law's silence. Edmund looked at him the way a man looks at a contract he has just voided. "My daughter," he said, "is not available to you." Downstairs, the bailiffs began their work. The sound of it, methodical, unhurried, irreversible, rose through the floorboards like a tide. The house was smaller than the manor. That had been a deliberate choice, and Jasmine had made it in the same quiet, considered way she had begun making all her choices, not reactively, not to prove something, but because she had sat with the question long enough to know what the honest answer was. She did not want grandeur. She had lived inside grandeur and understood, now, that it was simply another word for a place designed to impress people you did not love. The house was in Kensington. 4 stories, south-facing, with a garden that caught the afternoon light in a way that made the whole of it feel less like property and more like a promise. She had signed the lease herself. Her own signature. Every crossing of every letter exactly as it had always been. The child came 6 weeks after George left London. A girl, as Jasmine had somehow known she would be. Born on a Tuesday morning in February with the particular ferocity of someone who had been waiting long enough. Edmund had sat outside the door through the whole of it, and when Mrs. Aldridge, who had given notice at the manor the morning of the bailiffs and arrived at Jasmine's new door 2 days later without explanation or fanfare, brought him the news, he had pressed both hands flat against his knees and looked at the ceiling for a long moment before he trusted himself to stand. They named her Clara. Not for anyone. Simply because it meant clear and bright, and Jasmine had decided those were the only things worth building toward. It was a Thursday in April when Jasmine first stood on the balcony with Clara against her chest, the girl 3 months old and already studying the world with a concentration that made her grandmother's people smile and her grandfather say, privately, that she had the Hartwell eyes. London spread below them in its complicated, indifferent entirety, the rooftops and the river, the smoke and the steeples, the whole vast machinery of a city that had never once stopped moving for any single person's collapse. George Walsh's name appeared briefly in the financial notices in March. Then not at all. Jasmine did not look for it. She was not that woman anymore, the one who waited, and watched, and made herself small enough to be manageable. She held her daughter against the April light. She had built this. All of it. And it was only the beginning. Jasmine never begged. She never broke. She simply waited, and then she burned it all down with a signature and a father who'd been sharpening the blade for years. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to remember, grace is not weakness. It's the longest game.